Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in today. This is the Bodega Cat Book Club Financial Edition. And today we're continuing our reading of The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. And today we'll be reading chapter 10, and this is part 1. Hey, I hope you guys are enjoying this book. I know I am. Learning about the history of the Federal Reserve and money and all that stuff. Okay, I'm just going to move the camera in a little bit. Oops, the other way for you guys to see a little better. If you have a book, you can follow with us. Or if you don't, you can follow along with the camera here. Whatever works for you. Okay, here we go. Chapter 10, the Mandrake Mechanism. The method by which the Federal Reserve creates money out of nothing, the concept of usury as the payment of interest on pretended loans, the true cause of the hidden tax called inflation, the way in which the Fed creates boom-bust cycles. In the 1940s, there was a comic strip character called Mandrake, the magician. His specialty was creating things out of nothing, and, when appropriate, to make them disappear back into that same void. It is fitting, therefore, that the process to be described in this section should be named in his honor. In the previous chapters, we examined the technique developed by the political and monetary scientists to create money out of nothing for the purpose of lending. This is not an entirely accurate description because it implies that money is created first and then waits for someone to borrow it. On the other hand, textbooks on banking often state that money is created out of debt. This also is misleading because it implies that debt exists first and then is converted into money. In truth, money is not created until the instant it is borrowed. It is the act of borrowing which causes it to spring into existence. And incidentally, it is the act of paying off the debt that causes it to vanish. And that footnote was from printed Federal Reserve notes that sit in the Treasury's vault do not become money until they are released into circulation in exchange for checkbook money that was created by a bank loan. As long as the bills are in the vault with no debt-based money to replace them, they technically are just paper, not money. There is no short phrase that perfectly describes that process. So, until one is invented along the way, we shall continue using the phrase create money out of nothing and occasionally add for the purpose of lending where necessary to further clarify the meaning. Okay. So, let us now leave the historical figures of the past and jump into their future. In other words, into our present, and see just how far this money/debt creation process has been carried and how it works. The first fact that needs to be considered is that our money today has no gold or silver behind it whatsoever. The fraction is not 54% nor 15%. It is 0%. It has traveled the path of all previous fractional money in history and already has degenerated into pure fiat money. The fact that most of it is in the form of checkbook balances rather than paper currency is a mere technicality. And the fact that bankers speak about reserve ratios is eyewash. The so-called reserves to which they refer are in fact treasury bonds and other certificates of debt. Our money is pure fiat through and through. It's like monopoly money. Probably another word for monopoly money, fiat money. The second fact that needs to be clearly understood is that in spite of the technical jargon and seemingly complicated procedures, the actual mechanism by which the Federal Reserve creates money is quite simple. They do it exactly the same way the goldsmiths of old did, they did it exactly the same way the goldsmiths of old did, except, of course, the goldsmiths were limited by the need to hold some precious metal in reserve, whereas the Fed has no such restrictions. The Federal Reserve is candid. The Federal Reserve itself is amazingly frank about this process. A booklet published by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York tells us the currency cannot be redeemed or exchanged for Treasury gold or any other asset used as backing. The question of just what assets back Federal Reserve notes has little but bookkeeping significance. And that quote was from, I Bet You Thought, Federal Reserve Bank of New York, page 11. The question of just what assets, oh, I read that already. Okay, sorry. All right, next paragraph. Elsewhere in the same publication, we are told banks are creating money based on the borrower's promise to pay, the IOU. Banks create money by monetizing the private debts of businesses and individuals. And that quote is from IBIT, page 19. In a booklet entitled Modern Money Mechanics, yeah, I read that booklet many years ago. Very interesting. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago says, in the United States, neither paper currency nor deposits have value as commodities. Intrinsically, a dollar bill is just a piece of paper. Deposits are merely book entries. Coins do have some intrinsic value as metal, but generally far less than their face amount. What then makes these instruments, checks, paper money, and coins, acceptable at face value in payment of all debts and for other monetary uses? Mainly, it is the confidence people have that they will be able to exchange such money for other financial assets and real goods and services whenever they choose to do so. This partly is a matter of law. Currency has been designated legal tender by the government. That is, it must be accepted. And that quote is from Modern Money Mechanics, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, revised October 1982, page 3. In the fine print of a footnote in a bulletin of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, we find this surprisingly candid explanation. Modern monetary systems have a fiat base, literally money by decree, with depository institutions acting as fiduciaries, creating obligations against themselves with the fiat base, acting in part as reserves. The decree appears on the currency notes. This note is legal tender for all debts, public and private. While no individual could refuse to accept such money for debt repayment, exchange contracts could easily be composed to thwart its use in everyday commerce. However, a forceful explanation as to why money is accepted is that the federal government requires it as payment for tax liabilities. Anticipation of the need to clear this debt creates a demand for the pure fiat dollar. And that quote is from Money, Credit, and Velocity. Review, May 1982, volume 64, number 5. Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, page 25. Money would vanish without debt. That is true. That's a true statement. Money would vanish without debt. It is difficult for Americans to come to grips with the fact that their total money supply is backed by nothing but debt. And it is even more mind-boggling to visualize that if everyone paid back all that was borrowed, there would be no money left in existence. That's right. There would be not one penny in circulation. All coins and all paper currency would be returned to bank vaults, and there would be not $1 in anyone's checking account. In short, all money would disappear. There's a book I read. I don't remember if I read it or not, but I have it. It's called Invest in Debt. I don't know if it's still in existence or circulation. Excuse me. I believe the author has passed. I think he's passed. But anyways, if I find it on Amazon, I'll put it underneath in the link below. Very interesting book. Invest in Debt. The author was a real estate guy. So interesting. Maynard Eccles was the governor of the Federal Reserve System in 1941. On September 30th of that year, Eccles was asked to give testimony before the House Committee on Banking and Currency. Interesting that they call it banking and currency. Currency. Currency, you could think of currency as like water currency, different other definitions of currency. The purpose of the hearing was to obtain information regarding the role of the Federal Reserve in creating conditions that led to the Depression of the 1930s. Congressman Wright Patman, who was chairman of that committee, interestingly, Pat on the back, man. Sorry, a little squirrel there. Congressman Wright Patman, who was chairman of that committee, asked how the Fed got the money to purchase $2 billion worth of government bonds in 1933. This is the exchange that followed. Eccles, we created it. Patman, out of what? Eccles, out of the right to issue credit money. Patman, and there is nothing behind it, is there, except our government's credit? Eccles, that is what our monetary system is. If there were no debts in our monetary system, there wouldn't be any money. You would have to find other currencies. It must be realized that, that was my little, that was my little 2 cents. You have to find other currencies. It must be realized that while money may represent an asset to selected individuals, when it is considered as an aggregate of the total money supply, it is not an asset at all. A man who borrows $1,000 may think that he has increased his financial position by that amount, but he has not. His $1,000 cash asset is offset by his $1,000 loan liability, and his net position is zero. Bank accounts are exactly the same on a larger scale. Add up all the bank's accounts in the nation, and it would be easier to assume that all the money represents a gigantic pool of assets which support the economy. Yet, every bit of this money is owed by someone. Some will owe nothing. Others will owe many times what they possess. All added together, the national balance is zero. So all this talk about national debt, not death, I mean national debt and debt ceiling and all that stuff, it's all bogus. It's all hot air. What we think is money is but a grand illusion. The reality is debt. Robert Hemphill was the credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank in Atlanta. In a foreword to a book by Irving Fisher titled 100% Money, Hemphill said this: if all the bank loans were paid, no one could have a bank deposit. And there would not be a dollar of coin or currency in circulation. This is a staggering thought. We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Everyone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we are prosperous. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. When one gets a complete grasp of the picture, the tragic absurdity of our hopeless situation is almost incredible. But there it is. And that quote was from Irving Fisher, 100% Money, New York, Adolphi, 1936, page 22. With the knowledge that money in America is based on debt, it should not come as a surprise to learn that the Federal Reserve System is not the least interested in seeing a reduction in debt in this country, regardless of public utterances to the contrary. Here is the bottom line from the system's own publications. The Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia says, a large and growing number of analysts, on the other hand, now regard the national debt as something useful, if not an actual blessing. They believe the national debt need not be reduced at all. And that quote was from the National Debt, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, page 2 and page 11. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago adds, oh, sorry, people. Sorry about the back and forth. I hope that's not too nauseating. The Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago adds, debt, public and private, is here to stay. It plays an important role in economic process. What is required is not the abolition of debt, but its prudent use and intelligent management. And that quote was from The Faces of Debt, Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago, page 33. What's wrong with a little debt? There is a kind of fascinating appeal to this theory. It gives those who expound it an aura of intellectualism, the appearance of being able to grasp a complex economic principle that is beyond the comprehension of mere mortals. And for the less academically minded, it offers the comfort of at least sounding moderate. After all, what's wrong with a little debt, prudently used and intelligently managed? The answer is nothing, provided the debt is based on an honest transaction. There is plenty wrong with it if it is based upon fraud. An honest transaction is one in which a borrower pays an agreed upon sum in return for the temporary use of a lender's asset. That asset could be anything of tangible value. If it were an automobile, for example, then the borrower would pay, quote, rent. If it is money, then the rent is called interest. Either way, the concept is the same. When we go to a lender, either a bank or a private party, and receive a loan of money, we are willing to pay interest on the loan in recognition of the fact that the money we're borrowing is an asset which we want to use. It seems only fair to pay a rental fee for that asset to the person who owns it. It is not easy to acquire an automobile, and it is not easy to acquire money, real money, that is. If the money we're borrowing was earned by someone's labor and talent, they are fully entitled to receive interest on it. But what are we to think of money that is created by the mere stroke of a pen or the click of a computer key? Why should anyone collect a rental fee on that? When banks place credits into your checking account, they are merely pretending to lend you money. In reality, they have nothing to lend. Even the money that non-indebted depositors have placed with them was originally created out of nothing in response to someone else's loan. So what entitles the banks to collect rent on nothing? It is immaterial that men everywhere are forced by law to accept these nothing certificates in exchange for real goods and services. We are talking here not about what is legal, but what is moral. As Thomas Jefferson observed at the time of his protracted battle against central banking in the United States, no one has the natural right to the trade of moneylender, but he who has money to lend. And that quote was from the writings of Thomas Jefferson, Library Edition, Washington Jefferson Memorial Association, 1903, volume 13, page 277 to 78. Third reason to abolish this system. Centuries ago, usury was defined as any interest charged for a loan. Modern usage has redefined it as excessive interest. Yeah, like 30% credit card interest. That's extortion, in my opinion. Certainly, any amount of interest charged for a pretended loan is excessive. The dictionary, therefore, needs a new definition. Usury, the charging of any interest on a loan of fiat money. Let us, therefore, look at debt and interest in this light. Thomas Edison summed up the immorality of the system when he said, "People who will not turn a shovel full of dirt on a project, nor contribute a pound of materials, will collect more money. Then will the people who will supply all the materials and do all the work." And that quote was from, as quoted by Brian L. Beck's The Hidden Hand, Spencer, Indiana, 01 Litho, 1975, page 161. Unfortunately, Edison did not understand the whole problem. He was correctly opposed in paying interest to banks for their fiat money, but he was not opposed to government fiat money. It was only the interest to which he objected. He did not see the larger picture of how fiat money, even when issued solely by the government and without interest, has always been destructive of the economy through the creation of inflation, booms, and busts. Is that an exaggeration? Let us consider the purchase of a $100,000 home in which $30,000 represents the cost of the land. Architect's fees, sales commission, building permits, and that sort of thing, and $70,000 is the cost of labor and building materials. If the home buyer puts up $30,000 as a down payment, then $70,000 must be borrowed. If the loan is issued at 11% over a 30-year period, the amount of interest paid will be $167,806. That means the amount paid to those who lend the money is about 2.5 times greater than paid to those who provide all the labors and all the materials. It is true that this figure represents the time value of that money over 30 years and easily could be justified on the basis that a lender deserves to be compensated for surrendering the use of his capital for half a lifetime. But that assumes the lender actually had something to surrender, that he had earned the capital, saved it, and then lent it for construction of someone else's house. What are we to think, however, about a lender who did nothing to earn that money, had not saved it, and in fact simply created it out of thin air? What is the time value of nothing? Infinity. As we have already shown, every dollar that exists today, either in the form of currency, checkbook money, or even credit card money, in other words, our entire money supply, exists only because it was borrowed by someone. Perhaps not you, but someone. That means all the American dollars in the entire world are earning daily and compounded interest for the banks which create them. A portion of every business venture, every investment, every profit, every transition, which involves money, and that even includes losses and the payment of taxes, a portion of all that is earmarked as payment to a bank. And what did the banks do to earn this perpetually flowing river of wealth? Did they lend out their own capital obtained through the investment of stockholders? Did they lend out the hard-earned savings of their depositors? No, neither of these was their major source of income. They simply waved the magic wand called fiat money. The flow of each unearned wealth under the guise of interest can only be viewed as usury of the highest magnitude. Even if there were no other reasons to abolish the Fed, the fact that it is the supreme instrument of usury would be more than sufficient by itself. Who creates the money to pay the interest? One of the most perplexing questions associated with this process is, where does the money come from to pay the interest? PLK, pluck from air. If you borrow $10,000 from a bank at 9%, you owe $10,900, but the bank only manufactures $10,000 for the loan. It would seem, therefore, that there is no way that you and all others with similar loans could possibly pay off your indebtedness. The amount of money put into circulation just isn't enough to cover the total debt, including interest. This has led some to the conclusion that it is necessary for you to borrow the $900 for the interest, and that in return leads to still more interest. The assumption is that the more we borrow, the more we have to borrow, and that debt, excuse me, and that debt based on fiat money is a never-ending spiral, leading inexorably, okay, another tongue twister word, okay, pause, inexorably, ugh, to more and more debt. What an interesting word, inexorably, to more and more debt. This is a partial truth. It is true that there is not enough money created to include the interest, but it is a fallacy that the only way to pay it back is to borrow still more. The assumption fails to take into account the exchange value of labor. Let us assume that you pay back your $10,000 loan at the rate of approximately $900 per month, and that about $80 of that represents interest. You realize you are hard-pressed to make your payments, so you decide to take on a part-time job. The bank, on the other hand, is now making $80 profit each month on your loan. Since this amount is classified as interest, it is not extinguished, as is the larger portion, which is the return of the loan itself. So this remains as spendable money in the account of the bank. The decision then is made to have the bank's floors waxed once a week. You respond to the ad in the paper and are hired at $80 per month to do the job. The result is that you earn the money to pay the interest on your loan, and this is the point, the money you receive is the same money which you previously had paid. As long as you perform labor for the bank each month, the same dollar goes into the bank as interest, then out the revolving door as your wages, and then back into the bank as loan repayment. This little section would be really great for a little cartoon kind of thing. I wonder if I'm sure there's probably one out there that explains this in cartoon form. I love cartoons. They're cute, they're nice, they're easy to understand. Anyways, if anyone finds it, share it in the comment links below. We would appreciate that very, very much. It is not necessary that you work directly for the bank. No matter where you earn the money, its origin was a bank, and its ultimate destination is a bank. The loop through which it travels can be large or small, but the fact remains all interest is paid eventually by human effort. That's why they call it human resource, right? Because we are the resource. We are the labor. We are the ones that keep the economy going. And the significance of that fact is even more startling than the assumption that not enough money is created to pay back the interest. It is that the total of this human effort ultimately is for the benefit of those who create fiat money. It is a form of modern serfdom in which the great mass of society works as indentured servants to the ruling class of financial nobility. Isn't that the truth? Understanding the illusion, that's really all one needs to know about the operation of the banking cartel under the protection of the Federal Reserve. But it would be a shame to stop here without taking a look at the actual cogs, mirrors, and pulleys that make the magical mechanism work. It is a truly fascinating engine of mystery and deception. Let us therefore turn our attention to the actual process by which the magicians create the illusion of modern money. First, we shall stand back for a general view to see the overall action. Then we shall move in closer and examine each component in detail. The Mandrake mechanism, an overview. Debt. The entire function of this machine is to convert debt into money. It's just that simple. First, the Fed takes all the government bonds which the public does not buy and writes a check to Congress to exchange for them. It acquires other debt obligations as well, but government bonds comprise most of its inventory. There is no money to back up this check. These fiat dollars are created on the spot for that purpose. By calling those bonds reserves, the Fed then uses them as the base for creating 9 additional dollars for every dollar created for the bonds themselves. The money created for the bonds is spent by the government, whereas the money created on top of those bonds is the source of all the bank loans made to the nation's businesses and individuals. The result of this process is the same as creating money on a printing press, but the illusion is based on an accounting trick rather than a printing trick. The bottom line is that Congress and the banking cartel have entered into a partnership in which the cartel has the privilege of collecting interest on money, which it creates out of nothing, a perpetual override on every American dollar that exists in the world. Congress, on the other hand, has access to unlimited funding without having to tell the voters their taxes are being raised through the process of inflation. If you understand this paragraph, you understand the Federal Reserve. Wow. This is a good paragraph to kind of stop the recording or pause and just reread it again. I don't quite understand it. I'll have to read it again. Wow. Money. Now, oh, excuse me. Got my allergies acting up today. Now for a more detailed view. There are three general ways in which the Federal Reserve creates fiat money out of debt. One is by making loans to the member banks through what is called the discount window. The second is by purchasing treasury bonds and other certificates of debt through what is called the open market committee. The third is by charging the so-called reserve ratio. Sorry, got a little distracted there. The third is by changing. The third is by changing the so-called reserve ratio that member banks are required to hold. Each method is merely a different path to the same objective, taking in IOUs and converting them into spendable money. The discount window. I heard about that a lot, the discount window. The discount window is merely bankers' language for the loan window. When banks run short of money, the Federal Reserve stands ready as the banker's bank to lend it. There are many reasons for them to need loans. Since they hold reserves of only about 1 or 2% of their deposits in vault cash and 8 or 9% in securities, their operating margin is extremely thin. It is common for them to experience temporary negative balances caused by unusual customer demand for cash or unusually large clusters of checks all clearing through other banks at the same time. Sometimes they make bad loans, and when these former assets are removed from their books, the reserves are also decreased and may in fact become negative. Finally, there is the profit motive. When banks borrow from the Federal Reserve at one interest rate and lend it out at a higher rate, there is an obvious advantage. It's called arbitrage, the official word. So, for example, banks borrow from the Federal Reserve. Let's say the banks borrow from the Federal Reserve at 1%, and then the banks lend it out to you to buy a house at 7%. So there is a 6% difference, and that's called the arbitrage. That's the amount, that's the interest that the bank makes, the profit that the bank makes. Okay, sorry, a little scroll there, but that is merely the beginning. When a bank borrows $1 from the Fed, it becomes a dollar reserve. Since the banks are required to keep reserves of only about 10%, they actually can lend up to $9 for each dollar borrowed. And there's a footnote about this. This 10% figure, 10-to-1 ratio, is based on averages. The Federal Reserve requires a minimum reserve of 10% on deposits over $47.6 million, but only 3% on deposits from $7 million up to that amount, and no reserve whatsoever below that amount. Reserves consist of vault cash and deposits at the Federal Reserve. See Federal Reserve press release, annual adjustments for reserve calculations, Regulation D, October 6, 2004. Let's take a look at the math. Assume the bank receives $1 million from the bank at a rate of 8%. The annual total cost, therefore, is $80,000, 0.08 times 1 million, 80,000. The bank treats the loan as a cash deposit, which means it becomes the basis for manufacturing an additional 9 million to be lent to its customers. If we assume that it lends that money at 11% interest, its gross return would be 990,000. That's 0.11 times 9 million, which is 990,000. Subtract from this the bank's cost of 80,000 plus an appropriate share of its overhead, we have a net return of about 900,000. In other words, the bank borrows $1 million and can almost double it in 1 year. That's leverage. But don't forget the source of that leverage, the manufacture of another 9 million, which is added to the nation's money supply. And that quote, footnote was about there's a footnote about the doubling in 1 year, doubling the amount. The banks must cover these loans with bonds or other interest-bearing assets which it possesses, but that does not diminish the money multiplier effect of the new deposit. Okay, I think we'll stop here for now. Very interesting chapter. I hope you enjoyed that, and we will continue our reading next week. In the meantime, I hope you guys all have a great day, great week, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye now.